All right, welcome back. We've got some BRAP. Thanks for watching KMR. Thanks for watching the previous videos. We've been talking about 20Bs. And then this past weekend, I was out at the Long Beach Grand Prix running the Formula Drift MX5 3-rotor and partaking in some pace car duties. So thanks for checking out those videos, as they're not the normal Rotary content. But now we're back to the BRAP. We're going to talk about 20Bs or 3 rotors, the Cosmo 3-rotor, a little more. I have some factory rotors, and this is a OEM factory set that came out of a motor that's getting a restoration, a rebuild. But I figured it was a really good opportunity to look at what Mazda put into these OEM motors. They were only in production from 1990 to 1995. So these motors overlapped the rx7, that was the second generation Mazda rx7, the 1989 to 91 Series 5 FC, and they overlapped the FD3S, which in the US only ran from 93 to 95. But the Cosmo motor itself, the 20B and 13B, never came to the US. It was actually a fairly rare car. And it's why the 3 rotors in used form, in hot rod form, and racing form are rare. Even though they're a factory motor, it was fairly limited production and a fairly interesting car. Available in 2 motor combinations, the two rotor and 3 rotor. So in a lot of ways, I think the Cosmo was kind of the jump that the RX-7 needed in some of its production enhancements and production generations, and the way they went from the FC to the FD. Some of the rotors changed shape, combustion pockets, the porting changed shape. And if you look at the Cosmo motors, they were really put right in between. And the first thing I always like to point out is the 20B, the rotors actually resemble the Series 5 1989 to 1991 RX-7 rotors, not the FD3S 93 to 95 or 93 to 99 in Japan rotors. So I think a lot of the times people think that the Cosmos or the 3 rotors had FD rotors, but in actuality, as far as I know and as far as I've seen in the majority of all the motors I've taken apart, in fact, actually all the motors that I've taken apart that I know were OEM have always had what would be the equivalent to the 1989 to 91 RX-7 rotors. So if you're ever needing to match up Cosmo rotors and you can't get a hold of a new Cosmo rotor, which the Cosmos were from, I believe, 1990 to 1995, and fairly limited parts availability. So if you're ever trying to find a rotor to match into your rotating assembly, or trying to figure out what generation rotors these are, I believe they're basically a continuation, because they were produced in 1990, which the RX-7 was still being produced. Those rotors were still being manufactured. The weights line up. Combustion pockets line up. You can match a 1989 to 91 RX-7 rotor to the 2-rotor or 3-rotor Cosmo rotors. So parts shareability, or an understanding of the weights, combustion pockets. They are turbo cast rotors, so they do have that factory cast T into the casting here. And another easy identification is the edge of this combustion pocket is more rounded than the FD3S, and the combustion pocket is machined versus the earlier RX-7 rotors that were still a cast pocket. So Mazda had gone into a time where they actually started to put a lot more effort into machining the combustion pocket, making sure the combustion pocket stayed similar in their rotating assemblies. And they were still making a fairly robust rotor, not getting light or as light as some of the later model rotors. But one other interesting thing that I've noticed about OEM 3-rotor 20B assemblies is compared to the 2-rotor assemblies, Mazda must have put a lot of effort into making sure they had weight matching or weight similarity in their sets. And for weighing purposes, this is grams. And you can see that as this is a factory assembly, the spread itself is very similar. You have a spread that's within, under 5 grams. And if you compare that to rx7 assemblies, a lot of the times you have a 20, 30, and in some cases even 40 gram spread, which we can still balance that. We can do high-speed race balancing, which the factory, they're balanced, but they're not balanced for racing. They're not balanced to the means that Mazda Tricks, or what I like, or what Mazda Speed did in their race assemblies. And it's always led me to believe that the 3 rotors were probably built to a higher quality. And one of the reasons is, at least my understanding is when it comes to balancing a 3 rotor, rotaries have front and rear counterweights. They've got front and rear rotors, so you're suspending the center rotor fairly in the middle. There's a little bit of weighing and mathematics going on with that center rotor to create a balanced assembly. So my understanding is it would be much harder and not necessarily as easy to do the mathematical calculations, or at least in a racing standpoint where you're trying to blueprint a motor or performance application motor. You would want closer spread so you can make an easier balance adjustment, or in the case of the 3 rotor where you're dealing with 2 counterweights, make an easier calculation to make sure that the spinning mass is neutralized under RPM and under load. So there's some interesting algorithms that actually Mazda used and are used in balancing to make sure this all happens. But again, I thought it was really interesting that Mazda, unlike the 2 rotors, kept everything really tight in their gram spread or in their weight spread. So kind of neat. These ones just got fresh bearings. Everything else basically similar to an RX7 rotor. Fairly thick webbing, thicker than the RX8. And when it came to the drilling and the material, thicker than the RX8 as well. Not quite as thick as the Series 4, not quite as heavy. Landing in between Series 4 and FD3S. Again, I think that's where you have the Cosmo motor fitting in between, which was a predecessor to the FD, and in some cases, parts continuation of the RX7. Mazda had a good thing going. The late model FC3S rotors in turbo form, great rotors, no reason not to use them. And if you're trying to rebuild your 20B, or you're trying to find matching rotors for a 20B, it's definitely an option to use those Series 5 turbo rotors. And if you're ever coming across the Series 5 NA rotors, those are also a very desirable rotor, maybe not for a 20B, but for a naturally aspirated RX7 application, or if you were trying to build a naturally aspirated 20B, my preferred option would be to go to the non-turbo Series 5 89 to 91 rotors. So there's some tips and some information from what I've seen, some knowledge, just that 20Bs were built with care from the factory. They spent time getting their gram spreads, their weights close. And from what I know with Mazda Tricks balancing, it also makes a difference. So with all of my personal race motors, I've always made sure to keep a close gram spread. And we've always been able to push the limits of those motors, as you can see in drifting, 1,000 horsepower, high RPM, and we have a very reliable combination. So this one maybe not a high horsepower build, but a restoration project. And it's very cool to see an OEM set of 20B rotors cleaned up out of the Sonic tank, fresh bearings, courtesy Mazda Tricks, and getting ready to go back together. So that's a wrap. Let me know if you have questions, and maybe we'll do a comparison next of the 20B Cosmo rotors to the FD3S and FC3S rotors, so we can kind of line up those minute differences that Mazda put in there. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. KMR, I'm out.